Okay, we are back for the final trig function graph, cosecant x. And cosecant is the reciprocal of sine x. And so we're going to base this off of our knowledge of sine. Sine of 0 is 0. So the cosecant of 0 will be 1 over 0. So we will have a vertical asymptote right here on the y-axis. We will have a vertical asymptote also at pi and at 2 pi. The sine of pi over 2 is 1, so that will be 1 over 1 for cosecant. And the sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1, so cosecant of 3 pi over 2 would be 1 over negative 1, and that's going to be right in the middle of that 3 pi over 2. I'll make it big so we can see it. Right? So we have those values. Okay, now we need to get uh, the graph shape going. Now, once you've seen secant and you know it's U-shapes up and down, well, cosecant's also going to be U-shapes up and down. They're just going to be placed at different locations. So I can come over here and say what's happening from 0 to pi over 2, what's happening in the first quadrant. But I can also just say, hey, look, here's this dot right here at pi over 2. That's going to be the basis for a U-shape opening up. And this one at 3 pi over 2 is going to be the basis for a U-shape opening down. And then I don't have to go all the way back and try to sort it out from the beginning. I have a little knowledge I can bring with me about the graph shapes. So when you're going to do one of these graphs for me on a quiz, you don't want to just memorize graphs. Right? I've got 2 periods over here on the right, and this is just going to be repeating the cycles on the left. So alternating U-shapes up and down. So don't try to memorize every detail of the graph. Right? What I would like you to memorize is that tangent and cotangent look like chutes and ladders. They go up and down with asymptotes in between. And memorize that secant and cosecant are alternating U-shapes up and down. Don't try to memorize where the asymptotes go. You can get the asymptotes from the graphs of sine and cosine from those basic identities. And that way, all you have to really memorize are graph shapes. And then you want to know the specific graphs for sine and cosine. Sine and cosine graphs are much easier to memorize. And if you memorize those, then everything else can build off of sine and cosine. And that's your general plan anytime you're dealing with trig functions, tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant in any sense. If you're not sure what to do with them, well, take them back to sine and cosine, and from there you can probably figure it out. Now, I showed you with secant that you can base it off of the graph of straight off of the graph of cosine. You can base cosecant straight off of the graph of sine. If I look at the graph of sine, it starts here at the origin, up, down, and over. Same thing over here on this side. And so in the exact same way that we had on cosine, everywhere that sine is 0, we will have a vertical asymptote. So I could graph the graph of sine first, and then out all those zeros, put my asymptotes. And then everywhere that sine has a max, that's where secant or cosecant will meet it. Everywhere that it has a min, that's where cosecant will meet it. And so you can get those locations for the U-shapes, and then you can draw your U-shapes. And then when you're done, you can come back and erase your sine graph, or at least, or partially erase it. If you're doing this for me on a quiz, you don't have to erase the sine graph completely. Just, maybe make the cosecant graph darker and the sine graph fainter and lighter, because I don't mind if you use this as the method to graph these when we take the quiz. When we take the quiz over the trig graphs, you will have to graph either tangent or cotangent. You'll graph one of those two, and you'll have to graph either secant or cosecant. You'll have to graph one of those two. So, and you're not going to know which ones ahead of time. So you want to make sure that you can generate these graphs with no aids at all, no calculator, nothing else except what we use just here. You will not have the little table that you're using for it to generate these values. So you're going to have to take everything back to sine and cosine graphs, and you can generate them straight from that. So memorize your sine and cosine graphs, know your graph shapes for tangent and cotangent, secant and cosecant, and then you should be, as long as you know those graph shapes, you should be in good shape for being able to create these. You need to practice it, right? Sit down and say, okay, from scratch, can I graph secant? And you sit down and you try to come up with it. You go back and you match up with what we did and see if you can do it right. And if you can do that, then you'll be ready for the quiz. And if you can't do that, then you need to go back, maybe watch the video again, see how we did things, and get to the point to where you can do it with no help at all. All right, well, that's the 6 trig graphs. Hope you've enjoyed this.